Good day, everyone. Composer99 here, and welcome to Axis Empires Ultimate Edition. Axis Empires is a strategic and operational board game emulating the Second World War, published by Decision Games. This is a video series intended to show how the game works for newer players. Axis Empires has essentially two games combined into one: Totaler Krieg, which is the European theater game, and Die Senso, the Asia-Pacific theater game. We're going to focus on Totaler Krieg, which, to my estimation, is an easier game to play when you're learning the system. The other thing I should note is we're not going to be playing with any optional rules. The game, of course, has optional rules, but they add layers of complexity that I think, for the most part, we want to avoid when you're just learning the game. The one optional rule I would consider playing as a new player is the luck rule. We're still not going to play with that, but that would be a consideration when you're new to the game, especially because it can help attenuate some of the bad things that can happen. As I mentioned, this video series is going to be covering a playthrough of Totaler Krieg with the view of helping newer players understand how the game works. This particular video, we're going to talk about a few important gameplay concepts, and then we're going to go through each of the three factions of the game and discuss sort of overall strategy, but mainly their early game strategy during the pre-war phase. The three factions, of course, are the Axis, consisting of Germany and its minor country allies, the Western faction, Britain, France, and eventually the United States and their other allies, and finally, the Soviet faction, consisting of the Soviet Union and any countries that, for whatever reason, join up with it. I should note that in this game, the Soviet Union is referred throughout as Russia. The Western and Soviet factions together, of course, are the Allied side. They're in it together to beat the Axis. So let's get on with important game concepts. All right, let's talk about important gameplay concepts. I should mention to start off with that we're mostly focusing on these concepts as they apply to the two-map campaign games, and especially to the full 1937 scenario. The game has a variety of scenarios that have different start dates. They have a few training scenarios, for example, a scenario where you just have to conquer Poland as the Germans, and they have a couple of one-map games where you just play through the Eastern Front or Western Front. But we're going to focus on the two-map games and particularly the 1937 game. The first concept that I want to draw to your attention is the calendar and the importance of summertime. So let's zoom in on the calendar a bit here. As you can see, each game year is 9 turns long, and each of these game turns, each faction will take a single turn, where they'll get to maybe play politics and maybe move and fight with their units. Some of the turns, there are bad weather in different weather zones on the map, but the most important season is the summer season. As you can see, it is the longest season, and it is the only season where there is good weather in the North weather zone. So just for reference, let's zoom out a bit here. The North weather zone is almost the entire map. The desert weather zone is Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, and British Palestine. That's it. That's all it is. Everywhere else is the North weather zone. So the summertime is when most of the action is going to happen because that's when the weather is at its best in the north. That's when you'll have your Operation Overlord or your Operation Bagration or your Operation Barbarossa and so on and so forth. Because it's 3 turns long, that's also the turn when you want to have your most significant plays in terms of how often you want them to take effect during the early part of the game when it comes to politics. So for example, the Axis might play a card allowing them to support the Spanish nationalists in the Civil War. Well, summer might be a good time for that play because they're going to have 3 chances to affect the Civil War instead of 2 like in the other seasons. The next concept we want to look at is the war state. Over here, there's a lot of important ground covered in just this tiny little corner of the map. The war state is over here. In a 1937 game, the game starts in pre-war and then moves to limited war and total war as the game goes on. Each of these war states is a very distinct state of play. They're almost different games even. And total war could even be said to be two different war states in one. During the early part of total war, that's when the Axis are sort of reaching their mid-game supremacy, and then the late game, the Allies turn things around and rapidly crush the Axis. At least that's typical. Each war state is associated with restrictions on what each side can do during play, with total war having effectively no restrictions and limited war and pre-war having increasingly harsh restrictions. They define what option cards you are allowed to play. Your option card deck, and we'll talk about option cards later, but your option card deck has pre-war, limited war, and total war cards, and you may only play cards belonging to a particular game state during that state or later state. So for instance, you can play pre-war cards during pre-war or limited war or total war, but you may only play total war cards during total war. Moving on, let's look at the VP track right over here. The VP track itself is the middle set of boxes of these three tracks that you use to keep track of who is currently winning the game. As you can see, there are 5 VP boxes numbered 0 through 4, and then there's an automatic Total War victory box. Don't expect to see play reach that box very often. It can happen, but it's not likely. The top and bottom boxes of the track are keeping track of something called strategic value. Strategic value relates to who controls strategic hexes or objective hexes on the map. There are 3 sets of strategic hexes. These red hexes immediately below the VP box are Soviet hexes. Moscow, Leningrad, Minsk, and so on and so forth. The middle of the map is usually dominated by Axis strategic hexes: Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, even Warsaw. And the western side of the map, and down in the Middle East, there are a bunch of Western strategic hexes: London, Brussels, Paris, and others. The Axis is trying to seize control of as many Western and Soviet hexes as it can. And towards the end of the game, the Allied factions are trying to take control of as many Axis hexes as they can. The difference between the numbers of these hexes that each side controls becomes your strategic value. If the Axis controls more Western and Soviet hexes than the other sides control Axis hexes, the strategic value will be positive, and the VP marker will be flipped to its Axis tied side. If the strategic value is negative, as you can see along the bottom, the marker will be on its Allied Crusade side. The game starts with a strategic value of 0, so it starts in the 1 VP Allied Crusade box. One important consequence of the VP track is its effect on political die rolls. And we're going to talk about political die rolls in a little bit. But let's move on to the other important box up here, the posture display. The posture display tells you the disposition of allied countries. So the Axis countries, Germany and any active Axis minor country, they always have a posture of war, so they don't appear in this display. Neutral minor countries that haven't been brought into play yet, they could end up aligning with the Axis or the Western faction or the Soviet faction, depending on what circumstance causes them to come into play. The Allied factions, as you can see, they all have this starting posture. The United States has a posture of isolation. Great Britain and France have a posture of appeasement. The Western minors have this posture Locarno Treaty. Russia has the posture Rapallo Treaty. And the Soviet minors have a posture Cordon Sanitaire. Different postures are going to have different gameplay effects. Most of the postures don't have their own sort of innate effects. There's no entry in the rules saying, if your posture is appeasement, blah, 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 blah. Although there are general effects of being affected by a posture, also known in the rules as a policy. a country that is under a policy is much more restricted in the things it can do. Essentially, when you're under a policy, you're neutral. You haven't entered the war yet, or you have perhaps exited the war for a spell. The Allies and Axis can do things that will cause postures to change, or that will cause you to remove postures from this display. And when you remove a posture from a display, the country under that posture is at war. If a rule tells you to remove a posture from the posture display, you remove every instance of that posture. So for example, if it were to come about that Germany could declare war on France or Britain right now, while they have a posture of appeasement, both their posture boxes would be emptied, and so they would both be at war. So one of the goals of the Western faction, or I should say of the Allied side generally, is to link the minors' postures together with at least one major power posture, so that Germany can't beat up on minor countries on their own. They have to fight you. That's what's going to start the war. The last important box up here is the ceded lands box. I'm not going to talk about that too much in detail, except that's sort of telling you who has surrendered lands to you and their disposition. So for example, the game starts, Syria has been ceded to France as a dependent, which is kind of a sub-country. The game calls political entities countries, regions, and countries, dependents, and regions. Dependents are sort of sub-country, and regions are not even that. A region might include, say, Bessarabia. Syria nominally is its own country, but starts play as a French dependent. Events in the game can cause some ceded lands markers in the box to be removed from the box. So this French ceded land marker can be removed, which causes Syria to once again become its own minor country. Let's carry on by talking a bit about politics. I don't want to get into too much political detail, but there are a bunch of political events during the game, and in particular during the early game you're going to be playing a lot of politics because you don't have military play to do yet. And you'll do a little bit of political play once the war starts, but of course your focus is increasingly going to be on military activities. One thing you have to be careful about is that politics is unreliable. You're rolling dice, and you might be rolling on some of these tables in the political events tables up here on your aid card, and there's often a chance that nothing will happen or that something will blow up in your face. So you just have to watch out for that. You'll just have to put up with a certain degree of uncertainty. I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about political die roll modifiers that result from the VP track when we talk about politics. When your victory point marker is on its Axis Tide or Allied Crusade side, that affects political die rolls. So if we look back to our political aid card, it's +1 for each VP in the box occupied by the Axis Tide VP marker, -1 for each VP in the box occupied by the Allied Crusade marker. So when Axis Tide is in effect, you're likely to roll higher on all these political results tables, and when Allied Crusade is in effect, you're likely to roll lower. These modifiers aren't necessarily good or bad in and of themselves. It depends on what political table you're rolling on. The final concept I want to talk about before we move on is option cards. So option cards are sort of what drives the play of the game. You're going to play option cards every seasonal turn. These turns on the calendar that have the red boxes. They don't drive play the way that cards drive play in what are called card-driven games, so Paths of Glory, I think, or Twilight Struggle, where you're sort of having to choose to trade off between playing cards for your operations on the board and for their political effects. You play an option card during a seasonal turn, and it just takes effect. It'll have a variety of effects in the game, and they're going to drive play during that season to some greater or lesser extent. Some of your option cards are just going to add units to your force pool or allow you to place units on the map. Some of your cards are going to have political effects. Maybe you'll have to roll a political die roll. Some of the cards are even going to change the game state. With all that out of the way, let's get started talking about faction strategy. And we're going to follow the same order that the rules always make you play in, which is Axis, Western, and finally Soviet. Let's talk about Axis strategy. The Axis faction, as we noted earlier, consists of Germany and its minor country allies. I should mention here that Italy is treated as a minor country by the rules. In some other games, it's considered a major power. In this game, it's a minor country. And that just makes the rules surrounding the disposition of Italy a little cleaner, in particular, some of the rules that can affect it during the later part of the game when it gets knocked out of the war. The Axis faction starts with two one-step German units. Let's zoom in and take a look. Super impressive, right? These two little units here. And these one-step infantry units are sort of the backbone of your armies throughout the game. Germany actually starts with a lot of them in its force pool. So what you're trying to do is get them all out on the map and then build them up into bigger units, which we can find in the counter tray. Here we are. So the counter tray, you can see you can get some armor or panzer units, as the German ones are called, and a variety of other air units, maybe even submarines, a couple of other markers we're not really going to talk about. But the bulk of your operations will be conducted by one-step units that you combine into these two or three-step units. You can see this is a two or three-step unit here. You combine one-step units into those. Germany has a lot of those two or three-step armies, and that's the source of your offensive punch in the early part of the game and your defensive fortitude once the allies are coming back at you later. As far as setup goes, I usually like to just set these infantry steps right up here in these forested hexes along the French frontier. And then, you have your defense set up against France, and you'll just build up your units as you go during play. The heart, of course, of German pre-war play is the option cards you choose. And you have your pre-war cards, your limited war cards, your total war cards. Your pre-war cards belong to four basic categories, and you'll eventually see that everyone's cards kind of also follow that pattern. You have rearmament cards that are going to mostly just put units on the map or add units to your force pools. You have what you might call major power politics cards that affect your relationships with other major powers, mostly by manipulating the policy that's affecting them. You have minor country politics cards that affect your relationship with minor countries. In the case of Germany, most of these are territorial demands that you make of your neighbors. The final category of card are your Civil War support cards. So, as Germany, you're trying to support the nationalists, of course. During pre-war, you're going to play different cards at different times in order to build up your forces and try to get as much territory as you can from your neighbors without going to war until you're actually ready to go to war. At some point, you're either going to spark a war because you have a demand go badly, or you're going to just, want to go to war because you're running out of cards to play. You have to eventually enter limited war at some point or another. As you can see, most of these cards have been sort of organized row by row into the categories, although the second row here is a mixture of your major power and minor power in diplomacy. Your major power diplomacy is your card 4. You have two different cards for, as you can see. You're only ever going to get to play one of them. One of them, Nazi-Soviet Pact, is major power diplomacy. It's going to change the disposition of the Soviet Union. So it's going to change Russia and Soviet miners' posture to pact. So on the one hand, that's going to make it very hard for Russia to enter the war if that's what they want to do. On the other hand, it also means that they have the same posture as Soviet miners. So we mentioned earlier that one of the goals of the Allies is to make sure that Minor country postures are the same as major country postures, so that when you go to war with minor countries and remove their policy, you're going to remove every instance of the same policy. So when Russian and Soviet minors both have a posture of pact, going to war with a minor country that aligns with the Soviet faction automatically means going to war with the Soviet Union. Your other card for Pact of Steel is not major power politics. Instead, that's making it a lot easier for you to bring minor countries on your side. Most games, I think you're going to see people play Nazi-Soviet Pact. And the reason for that is, well, two reasons actually. One of them, of course, is that you're getting these sweet, sweet German steppes. And you can get a lot of minor country steppes out of Pact of Steel, but minor countries don't have, they're not as good as major country steppes and German steppes in particular. You know, a lot of them are these not so great 0-1-2 units as opposed to your 1-2-3 infantry steppes, and you know they don't have a lot of panzers. That's one consideration. The other consideration is the threat of a Franco-Russian Entente, which we'll talk a bit more about when we're discussing Western and Soviet factions. But basically, there's a chance that they can revive the old pre-Great War Franco-Russian Entente, which puts you at risk of a two-front war right off the bat. Obviously, that's undesirable. You don't want to fight a two-front war right off the bat. So for those two reasons, building up the German army and the threat of Entente, most often you're going to see Nazi-Soviet Pact. All right, we're going to talk about the demand cards specifically when we get to that point during the playthrough, when we're starting to play them. I just should mention now, though, that some of your other cards that you're going to play earlier are forcing you to discard some of those cards. So you're going to have to decide which cards you want to keep based on which ones you want to play, and that should be dictated by your overall strategy. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pre-war German strategy. As we've mentioned, of course, the overall German goal is to seize control of as many Western and Soviet factions' strategic hexes as you can, and then hold on to them for as long as you can so that your VP marker is in a higher box on Axis Tide for as long as possible. Most often, you're going to then end up playing a total war card that's going to sort of fix your VP total at a particular value, and then the allies are going to have to beat that total in order to win the game. So, you know, you're trying to reach your high water mark and then sort of fix your VP value at that point. And historically, the Axis reached the 2 VP box. So if you can get to the 3 VP box, you're probably feeling at least a little better about your prospects. So your early game strategy in particular is trying to get yourself set up so that you're going to be able to accomplish your objectives during limited war when the allies are not as built up yet. Your rearmament cards, most of them you will see have these symbols on the top right corner of the card, right? The crossed wrench and hammer, I want to say. And those are actual rearmament cards, as it were, as defined in the rules. You can play one of these formal rearmament cards per year. So you play card 2 in 1937, card 3 in 1938, card 5 in 1939, and if for some reason the war hasn't started by then, you might even play card 6 in 1940. Card 6 is automatically going to start limited war, even if it doesn't actually get you at war with anyone as such. So that's just something to watch out for. You also might not often get to play card 6 unless you're lucky or maybe unlucky with your rolls. So again, I don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of German card planning just now. We'll talk about that during our subsequent videos during each year of war. But we want to keep in mind the importance of summertime. So usually during pre-war, that means whatever card has a political event that we want to see happen most often, or a conditional event, maybe not political, it could be one of these conditional events. Whatever event is on a card, if it's something that you want to see happen more often, that's the card to play during the summer. So for example, you probably, at least in 1937 and 1938, you probably want to play your support nationalist cards during the summer, so you have more chances to win the Spanish Civil War. Probably you want to play that card 2 or 3 times in order to get the extra benefits out of it, but you'd like to have the war wrapped up before you actually start your war. That would be nice. Of course, because of the unreliability of political roles, you can't guarantee it, but it's nice. And then in 1939, you're probably going to want your summer to be a card that is getting you a bunch of steps. So, for example, you might play Nazi-Soviet Pact in the summer to probably guarantee that you get 6 steps out of it. Alternatively, maybe you play German mobilization in the summer of 1939. If you have managed to play enough demand cards earlier and you have more seeded lands markers in the seeded lands box, you might get more steps, right? You could get like 3 steps out of it each turn. And if you play that over the summer, 9 steps it's pretty good. One thing to think about is timing when the war starts. You want to kind of arrange it so whoever you're going to fight, and you can go after either France or Russia during limited war, and you're probably going to beat them in limited war. But whichever side you want to go against, you're going to want to play your main offensive card in the summer, which means you're sort of trying to arrange to start the war so there's a few turns before the summer. And the reason for this is because of something called delay rolls. When you play the card that lets you add them to your force pool, sometimes it'll tell you to add them to the delay box first. And you also have this conditional event called Outbreak of War. So when limited war begins, all these units here in your conditional events box, they're going to go in the delay box as well. And then at the end of the turn, after the Soviet faction acts, everyone's going to roll dice to see how long it takes their units in the delay box to come into the map. Here's the delay box here. And then the vassal module I'm using has a separate turn track where you can throw down your delay rolls instead of having to split your attention between 2 tabs. So it's pretty customary to try and start the war in August, September, the autumn seasonal turn, because even if you roll really badly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, your units are going to appear when you need them at the start of the summer. You kind of want to plan to start the war around that time. So for instance, you might do that by playing a territorial demand that you think is likely to go badly. And usually you're probably going to want to do that in the autumn of 1939 because you're going to start to run low on pre-war cards. If your autumn 1939 territorial demand doesn't go badly, so if the country you've made a demand of actually gives you what you want without a fight, that's when you have your card 6 to get things going. And once again, you're going to want to think about playing your card 6 so that your outbreak of war is sure to give you your units by the following summer, so that you're going to have them available when you really need them. But most of the time, you're probably not going to get to play card 6 unless you really carefully massaged your card play to be able to. Which maybe you do. Maybe you want to have a prolonged pre-war phase. So that's overall German strategy and early German card play. And we'll talk about German card play during limited war and total war when we get to those game states. All right, let's look at the Western faction. So Western faction overall strategy, during the early war, or I should say during pre-war, you're trying to adjust your posture so that you are linked together with minor countries in such a way that you can go to war against Germany. As you can see, you don't start linked with minor countries, so it's easy for Germany to bully its neighbors. You want to change that if you can. Once the war starts, your primary goal is to weather the German onslaught as best as possible. And eventually, especially once you have the Americans in the war, you'll be able to turn things around and beat the stuffing out of the Germans. As far as Western faction setup goes, most of your units are fixed in place. So this Malta garrison here that has to start in Malta. Your Gibraltar Fortress starts in Gibraltar. You have these detachments, which are sort of sub-unit entities, and they are fixed in place as well. The only units you can freely place during setup are the steps in your French and British home countries. You have one British step and three French ones. The scenario builder, who created this vassal module, has already started the British step in London, which makes sense. That's where I would put it. And you're going to have a unit sticking in London for most of the game, both as a defense against invasion and as an airbase. And we'll talk about how air bases work once we actually are using our air units. The French steps, traditionally, are going to be along the frontier with Germany. That's your Western faction setup and overall strategy. Let's look at a little of the cards here. We've got it all zoomed in. During pre-war, you have the same general categories of card that the Germans do. Rearmament cards, major power relations, minor power relations, and Civil War cards. So instead of having the 5 or so Civil War cards that the Germans do, you have this one Support Republicans card, and it's recyclable. You can see that symbol in the top right corner, the circle made of arrows. That's telling you when you're done using that card, you put it back in your deck instead of discarding it forever. As with the Axis faction, your rearmament cards have to be played one per year if they have the rearmament symbol. So card 2, 1937, card 3, 1938, card 4, 1939. Card 5 has a 5A or 5B. Card 5A has to be played in 1940. I'm using those years, but if you accidentally wait too long and you don't play card 2 until 1940, then all of your cards have to be pushed back even further. So, keep that in mind when you're planning your card plays. Back to card 5. Card 5A is usually going to be played during 1940 because it can only be played once per year, these rearmament cards. Card 5B, if at some point in 1939 you're already at war, you can play card 5B instead of card 5A. And because it doesn't have the rearmament symbol, you can play it whenever you want, as long as you're at war. You can see the card also mentions these 2 times LBA with the weird sort of squiggly symbol. That's telling you those are units you get if you're playing with the Krieg expansion pack, so don't worry about that for now. So in your rearmament line of cards, your card 6 is going to shape the direction of the French military. You have 6A, which is going to the Maginot line, that's the historical play, and that's going to get you these 3 beefy fort units. Let's take a look. Where are we here? Here we go. There they are. Pretty sweet. Probably the best forts in the game. Traditionally, they're going to appear on this frontier, and they're going to funnel any potential German attack through Belgium, Holland. The other option is French military reforms. You get a weaker fortress that only goes in Metz, and then you get a bunch of extra units. Most importantly, you're going to get an interceptor. Those can affect some of your limited war cards. We're not going to talk about that right now, but it'll be something to keep in mind. And if you have the vassal module or if you have the board game proper, you can see those cards and see what they do ahead of time. Your card 7, you have a 7A, 7B, that's going to affect your major power relations. That's changing your posture. So Western Guarantees is linking Britain, France, and the Western miners into a single posture guarantees. That's the historical play. And what's going to happen is if Germany plays a demand card and it goes badly, and the Western minor postures guarantees, it's going to remove that posture. And because you've linked it to Britain and France, right, they all have the same posture, all 3 posture markers get removed, and that's starting the war. The other possibility is a Franco-Russian Entente. That comes at a cost of making it harder for Britain to get involved in the war, but you are getting France and Russia linked together in an alliance, and that means if Germany makes a territorial demand and it goes badly, it's going to end up at war with Russia and France at the same time. An important distinction between those 2 cards is that Germany can preempt Franco-Russian Entente by playing Nazi-Soviet pact, and they often will want to. But you can always play Western guarantees. There's nothing Germany can do to stop you. And take a note of the selection requirements there. Western guarantees requires that you have played card 3, which you can play as early as spring 1938. Franco-Russian Entente requires that you've played card 4, which you can play as early as spring 1939. So in theory, if you really want to, you could play Western guarantees as early as summer 1938. You probably, I'm not sure that you really want to, because, you might have a better thing to do with your summer card, but maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. Something to think about. All right, that's the Western faction. Let's carry on to the Soviets. The Soviet faction. Like the Western faction, the Soviet strategy can basically be summarized as try to interfere with German pre-war plans, weather the German onslaught, and, once you've built up enough, take the fight to Germany, hopefully culminating in occupying Berlin towards the end of the war. We're not going to look too much at Soviet setup right now because that's going to depend heavily on your rearmament plan. The Soviets have some of the most significant choices to make during pre-war that are going to affect what cards they have available later. As far as Soviet cards go, they have the same general categories as the other factions: rearmament, major power relations, minor power relations, and support Republicans. Like the Western faction, their support Republicans card is recyclable. You play it, and when you're done with it, it'll come back into your hand. They have several other recyclable cards that are unique. Forces for the Far East is going to affect your relations with Japan, which only exists in the standalone Totaler Krieg game in the Pacific War display, which we'll take a quick look at, but we're going to look at more detail when we actually get to the Pacific War. Here it is here. So that's going to indicate the disposition of the war against Japan with the two factions. You have a big enough army that you can easily do something about the Japanese if they decide to fight you early on through your Forces for the Far East card. So that's kind of major power relations, I guess you could say. You also have pre-war production, and you're the only faction that has this recyclable rearmament card that just lets you place 3 steps on the board. So you can get your army big if that's what you want to do. Your major power relations cards are Nazi-Soviet Pact and Franco-Russian Entente. So yes, you can create the Nazi-Soviet Pact if you want to. Although to be honest, you rarely will. You probably want the Germans to do that. You're actually kind of happy if your posture stays as Rapallo, at least depending on which path you have chosen for rearmament or politics. The other possibility is Franco-Russian Entente. So you also can create the Franco-Russian Entente. Unlike the Western faction, where their 2 card 7s had different years they could play them, you can only play yours after playing your card 3, so usually 1939 at the earliest. And again, the Germans can preempt your play of Franco-Russian Entente. As for some of the more consequential choices, these come up with card 5 and card 1. Card 5 is setting the tone for Russia's minor power relations. Political Purges is a more inward turn. It's the historical course, and with that, you're emphasizing bullying your neighbors for territory, like demanding Bessarabia, for instance. Collective Security, on the other hand, is a kinder, gentler approach, where you're trying to build a coalition against Germany. Instead of demanding Bessarabia, you might be trying to create a pact with your Balkan neighbors, for instance. Card 1 is setting the course for your rearmament. And you have 3 choices, 1A, 1B, 1C. 1A is the historical choice. It's, again, military purges. You're purging your army of suspected disloyal elements. It's the costliest card to play early, but it has some pretty solid effects later on. Your next option is Tukhachevsky Reforms, where you're modernizing your army. It has some pretty good effects now, right? You actually get to put new units on the map. You get a cool HQ. It's not so great later, though, when your generals who were all buddy-buddy with Germany in the interwar period when the Soviets were cooperating with Germany aren't super keen about fighting a war against Germany later on. Finally, you have Stalin Line Constructed, which is a very defensively oriented play. As you can see, you're getting a whole bunch of forts instead of units. Your card 1, whichever one you pick, is going to have repercussions later on down the road, as I mentioned. I mean, that's basically it for the Soviets until we actually get into specifics, and we'll talk about each of these cars one when we get to playing it during the 1937 playthrough. That's everything for now. So our next video, we're going to get started with the 1937 playthrough, and we'll decide where the Soviets are going to go. I hope you've enjoyed it. We look forward to seeing you again, and please feel free to like and subscribe.